You know, sometimes the stories you send us are so wild, they feel like something out of the movies.
Yeah.
This time we're talking Seville, Spain,
Right.
a place you probably picture, sunny plazas and flamenco dancing.
Hmm.
Well, get ready for a different kind of Seville, because this deep dive takes us into Seville's underbelly with a story about a police raid so big it involved helicopters, drones, and enough officers to rival a small army.
Yeah, what's really striking is not just the scale of this operation, but the location.
Right?
This isn't some far-off place we're talking about. Tres Mil Viviendas, a neighborhood right there in Seville. 300 officers descending on this area, armed to the teeth. It definitely makes you think about the serious security threat the city's dealing with.
Seriously. Like someone took a Narcos episode and just dropped it right into this picture-perfect Spanish city. And the article lays it all out there.
Yeah.
We're talking shootouts happening in broad daylight, drug cartels basically calling the shots, and a police force that seems like they were totally blindsided by the kind of firepower they came up against.
It really makes you stop and think. Even in places we associate with beauty and tourism, there are often these complicated social dynamics going on underneath the surface. This raid, this wasn't just some random thing.
Right?
It was a direct response to the surge in violence between rival drug gangs operating in Tres Mil Viviendas.
Okay, hold on a sec. Rival drug gangs with that kind of firepower.
Yeah.
That's a lot, even for a city like Seville.
So was this a slow burn, or did things just suddenly boil over? What was the tipping point that finally made the authorities launch this huge operation?
Well, it seems like things have been going downhill in Tres Mil Viviendas for a while now.
Mm-hmm.
But there were a few things that happened recently that really brought things to a head. The article talks about how brazen these gangs had become, even
Oh.
using military-grade weapons bought on the black market.
Wow.
So this wasn't just small-time stuff.
Right.
These groups were very organized, and they had enough firepower to require a serious response. It really does feel like something you'd see in an action film.
Yeah.
Except this is all too real for the people who live in Tres Mil Viviendas.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder, what's it like to live every day with that kind of tension? Knowing that a stray bullet could literally come flying at you at any moment.
It's a chilling thought, and the article does touch on the fear and uncertainty that people in this neighborhood face every day. Try to imagine being a parent afraid to even let your kids play outside.
Yeah.
Or imagine being a shopkeeper just trying to run your business with that constant threat of violence looming over you. This raid, as dramatic and disruptive as it might have been, was a last-ditch effort to try to get control back, to show these gangs that this reign of terror wouldn't be tolerated.
Right. It's like a double-edged sword, isn't it?
Yeah.
On the one hand, there's relief that the authorities are finally stepping in, but I bet there's also this deep-seated fear that this is just the beginning.
Exactly. And that's where this story shifts from a straightforward police raid to something much more complex. Because when you look closer at the details, you start to realize this isn't a case of a few bad apples.
Mm-hmm.
There's a much bigger picture here, a whole web of social and economic factors that have allowed this lawlessness to thrive.
Okay, so let's break that down. What are we talking about here? What sets Tres Mil Viviendas apart?
Well, the article points out that even the police were caught off guard by how organized these gangs were and the kind of firepower they had.
Yeah.
This tells us that the problem had been festering beneath the surface, maybe even underestimated, until it finally erupted and demanded a full-scale intervention.
So this wasn't just some random trouble spot, but a place where these criminal elements had really dug in and grown powerful.
Exactly.
What was it like for the people living there, though?
Yeah.
Did they feel completely abandoned by the authorities before this raid?
Right.
I mean, imagine being a resident and suddenly your street is crawling with police, helicopters are circling overhead. It must have been surreal.
The article talks about how city workers refused to even go into Tres Mil Viviendas without police protection, which speaks volumes about how dangerous they thought it was.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's a powerful statement. City workers, the folks who keep things running, were essentially saying, it's too risky for us to even do our jobs here.
Yeah.
And yet people live there, raise families, go about their lives. With that as the backdrop,
Yeah.
it just adds another layer to the whole situation, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And it's those layers, those human stories behind the headlines that we often miss when we just focus on the sensational parts of a story like this.
That's right. It's easy to get caught up in the drama of the raid, but what about what happens next? What happens to the people in this community once the helicopters fly away and the police tape comes down?
That's the question that really stays with you even after you finish reading the article.
Yeah.
Because while this raid might have been absolutely necessary, It's only one piece of a much larger problem.
It's like you're holding your breath, wondering if things will really change, or if this is just another chapter in a long, troubled story for Traceville Viviendas.
And to understand that, we need to look a bit deeper into the roots of this problem. If we really want to find solutions, we have to understand the why behind what makes the news.
All right, so let's get into it. What makes Traceville Viviendas tick? Why has it become this breeding ground for lawlessness? And more importantly, what can be done about it?
So you want to understand what makes Trace Mill Viviendas tick.
Yeah.
Well, picture this. You've got a neighborhood where unemployment is off the charts.
Right.
The article mentions how scarce jobs are there, and that just creates this feeling of hopelessness, especially for young people.
Yeah.
When people feel like they don't have a way to get ahead, like they don't have a chance to build a better future for themselves, well, it creates the perfect conditions for crime to take hold.
It's like that old saying, idle hands are the devil's workshop, right? But it's bigger than that. It's not just boredom. It's this lack of opportunity, this feeling of being stuck.
Right.
If you don't see any other way to make a living to take care of yourself or your family.
Yeah.
The pull of easy money, even if it's from something illegal, can be really powerful.
Exactly. And what often happens is these criminal organizations, they exploit that desperation.
Yeah.
They offer this sense of belonging and purpose that's missing everywhere else. It's a vicious cycle. Poverty leads to crime, which then just leads to more poverty. And the article doesn't get into all the details, but it does suggest that there aren't many support systems in place in Trace Mill Viviendas.
So not just a lack of jobs, but also a lack of resources.
Yeah.
Like community centers, after-school programs, things like that.
Right.
It's like the neighborhood has been left to fend for itself. And that can create an us versus them kind of mentality, you know?
You said it. When people feel isolated and forgotten, like the system's failed them, they're more likely to turn inward to depend on their own informal networks for support and protection. And in a place like Trace Mill Viviendas, those networks are often connected to criminal groups.
It's a recipe for disaster, isn't it?
Yeah.
You have poverty, lack of opportunity, almost no social support, and then you throw organized crime into the mix.
Yeah.
It's like a powder keg waiting to go off.
Exactly, and that's precisely what the authorities were up against in Trace Mill Viviendas.
Right.
This raid, as dramatic and disruptive as it was a necessary response. The situation was that out of control. But, and this is where the article leaves us with more questions than answers, a raid, no matter how big or how well planned it is really a short-term solution.
It's like putting a Band-Aid on a much bigger wound, isn't it? It might stop the bleeding for a bit, but it doesn't deal with what caused it in the first place.
Exactly. And for Trace Mill Viviendas, that wound runs deep.
Yeah.
It goes back decades. Social and economic inequality, neglect, marginalization.
So how do you move forward? If a police raid isn't enough, what's the answer?
Yeah.
How do you tackle such a complex web of problems?
Well, the article does hint at a couple of potential ways forward.
Okay.
First, there's the promise of a constant police presence in Trace Mill Viviendas.
Good.
The authorities have said they'll maintain a visible presence in the neighborhood to discourage any more violence and to let residents know they're not being forgotten.
It's a start, I guess. At least it shows the community that someone is paying attention, that they aren't being completely ignored. But I imagine for some residents, seeing more police might bring up complicated feelings.
Oh, absolutely. And that's the tricky part for the authorities.
Yeah.
They need to find that balance.
Right.
Because while having a visible police force might prevent some crime, it can also create tension, especially if people feel like they're being watched instead of protected.
It's that fine line between keeping people safe and making them feel like they're living in a police state.
Right.
So, besides more police, what else is being considered? Because it feels like that alone won't solve the problem. It might quiet things down for a little while, but what about those deeper problems we discussed, like the poverty and lack of opportunity?
That's where long-term solutions come into play.
Okay.
And the article does mention some initiatives to address the root causes of the issues.
Okay.
For instance, there's talk of putting money into social programs, creating job training, and providing support for local businesses.
Okay, so actually trying to break the cycle by giving people a genuine chance to build better lives for themselves.
Right.
It makes sense, but Those kinds of things take time, resources, and a commitment from both the government and the people in the community.
Exactly. And that's often the hardest part. It's easy to say these programs are needed, but to actually fund them properly and make sure they're reaching the right people,
Yeah.
that's a whole other thing. And then there's the matter of trust.
Right. Because if you've been let down by the system again and again, why would you believe that this time it's going to be any different?
Exactly. Rebuilding trust, it takes time and consistent effort.
Yeah.
It takes really listening to the community, understanding their needs, and getting them involved in finding the solutions.
So it sounds like there's a glimmer of hope, but it's going to be a long and uncertain road ahead for Trace Mill Viviendas.
Yeah.
It's like they're at a crossroads,
Mm-hmm.
and the direction they choose will decide their fate.
And that's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, the future of Trace Mill Viviendas depends not just on what the authorities do, but on the strength and resilience of the community itself.
Which leads to a really big question.
Yeah.
What role does the community play in all of this?
Yeah.
Are they just bystanders caught in the middle? Or can they actually be a force for change?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And honestly, the article doesn't really dig deep into the community's role,
Right.
but it does offer a few signs of hope.
Okay, let's hear them. I think we all need a little dose of optimism right now.
Right. Reading this article actually it made me think about this documentary I saw once
Okay.
about a community garden in a neighborhood that was really struggling.
Hmm.
It became a real center point for people living there.
Right.
A place to grow food, connect with their neighbors, and just build a feeling of shared purpose.
Yeah.
It reminded me that sometimes the best solutions come from the people themselves.
That's a really great point. Like, instead of waiting for someone to swoop in and fix everything,
Right.
the community takes charge, finds its own ways to be strong and resilient. I love that. Were there any signs of that kind of grassroots action in the article? Any hints that people in Trace Mill Viviendas are starting to organize themselves to take back their neighborhood?
There were a few hopeful signs, like the article mentions this local priest who's been working nonstop to try and make peace between these rival gangs,
Wow.
trying to get them talking and find some common ground.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a short bit about a women's group that's been putting together workshops and support groups for families dealing with the effects of the violence.
Okay, so maybe not a full-fledged community garden just yet,
Right.
but definitely some seeds of hope.
Yeah.
People stepping up to fill in the gaps, to
Mhm.
offer support and guidance. It's like, even when things seem really bleak,
Yeah,
you find these little sparks of compassion, people looking out for each other.
exactly. And those sparks, they can grow into something much bigger if you take care of them.
Yeah.
If you're given what they need to thrive.
So what can be done? If you had all the power, what would you do to help a community like Trace Mill Viviendas escape this cycle of violence and poverty?
Wow, that's a big question.
Yeah.
If I had a magic wand,
Yeah.
I'd say it takes a multifaceted approach. It's about investing in education and job training, giving people a real chance at a better future.
Mm-hmm.
It's about access to mental health care to deal with the trauma of living in fear for so long.
Yeah.
And it's about giving power to those grassroots groups, those community leaders who are already doing so much.
It's about creating this whole safety net, both from above and from within.
Right.
So the community has the tools and the support to heal and rebuild. And hey, maybe that community garden isn't such a crazy idea after all.
I like how you think, because really, when you get down to it, the story of Trace Mill Viviendas, it's not just about crime and poverty.
Right.
It's a story about resilience, about the strength of a community, and this constant hope for a better future.
And that's a powerful message to hold on to, right?
Yeah.
So to everyone listening, we'll leave you with this. The next time you come across a story about a place like Trace Mill Viviendas, don't just skim the headlines. Stop for a second and think about the people behind those headlines. Think about those complicated situations that don't always make it into the news. And ask yourself, what can I do, even in a small way, to help create a world where every community has the opportunity to succeed?
That's a great point to end on.
Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive. We'll be back next week with another look behind the headlines.